The woman standing in front of Colfax Mercantile had skin the color of rich earth, eyes that held both sadness and fierce pride, and wore a faded calico dress that had been mended so many times the original pattern barely showed through. Grace Patterson waited outside the general store on that blistering July afternoon in 1877, watching as Randolph Sterling emerged from the establishment with 3 clerks trailing behind him, their arms laden with packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Grace stepped forward, her hand raised slightly, prepared to ask the richest man in Colfax, New Mexico territory about the seamstress position his wife had supposedly mentioned at church last Sunday. Randolph Sterling walked past her as though she were made of air, his gaze fixed somewhere above her head, beyond her, through her, never once acknowledging that another human being stood mere inches from his silk-lined coat. The clerks hurried after him, and Grace stood there with her hand still half raised, feeling the familiar sting of invisibility settle over her shoulders like a worn shawl. She lowered her hand slowly, watching as Sterling climbed into his polished carriage, the leather seats gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Her throat tightened, but she refused to let tears come. She had experienced this brand of dismissal countless times since arriving in Colfax 6 months ago. A young woman of mixed heritage in a town where lines were drawn with brutal clarity. Her mother had been Negro, her father white, and that combination meant she belonged nowhere completely. Accepted by neither community fully, tolerated by most, embraced by few. Grace turned away from the mercantile, adjusting the basket on her arm that contained the last loaf of bread she could afford this week. Her stomach growled softly, reminding her that she had given most of yesterday's meal to Mrs. Chen next door, whose husband had been injured in a mining accident. Grace's own situation was precarious, her savings from her previous work in Santa Fe nearly depleted, her small room in the boarding house paid through the end of the month, and no further. She started walking down the dusty main street of Colfax, past the saloon where piano music tinkled discordantly, past the barber shop with its red and white poles spinning lazily, past the land office where men in suits studied maps and dreamed of empire. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Grace could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath her dress. She walked with her head high, though, refusing to show the desperation that gnawed at her insides like a persistent animal. The livery stable sat at the end of Main Street, a large wooden structure that smelled of hay and horse and leather. Grace heard the sound of hammering as she approached, steady and rhythmic. She paused, drawn by the sound of honest work, and peered into the dimness of the stable's interior. That was when she saw him. He stood beside a stall, one foot braced against a wooden beam, working on repairing a saddle that had seen better days. His shirt was worn thin, patched at the elbows, open at the collar to reveal sun-bronzed skin. Dark hair fell across his forehead, slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, strong and capable, coaxing the leather into submission with tools that looked older than he was. He could not have been more than 25, she guessed, though hard work had carved lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under an unforgiving sun. He looked up then, perhaps sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the dim space of the stable. His were the color of summer sky, startlingly blue against his tanned face, and they widened slightly as he saw her. He stopped working completely, his hands going still on the leather, the hammer hanging loose in his grip. He stared at her as though she had materialized from his dreams, as though she were the first drink of water after days in the desert, as though the world had suddenly rearranged itself around her presence. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks under his gaze, but it was different from the burning shame of being ignored. This was something else entirely, something that made her heart beat faster and her breath catch in her throat. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was low and rough, unpracticed at formal speech but carrying genuine warmth. She realized she had been staring just as intently as he had, and she forced herself to speak. "I was just walking past. I apologize for disturbing your work." "No disturbance," he said quickly, setting down the hammer and straightening to his full height. He was tall, she noticed, rangy in the way of men who spent their lives on horseback. "Are you looking for someone? Or maybe your horse needs tending?" Grace shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "I do not have a horse. I cannot afford one." He studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition perhaps of shared circumstances. His clothes were patched, his boots worn nearly through at the sole. Whatever money he made here, it was not much. "I am Daniel Winters," he said, stepping forward and extending his hand. The gesture surprised her. Most white men in Colfax did not offer to shake her hand. She took it, feeling the calluses rough against her palm, the strength in his fingers as they closed gently around hers. "Grace Patterson." "Grace," he repeated, as though testing how her name felt in his mouth. He did not release her hand immediately, and she did not pull away. They stood there in the doorway of the livery, connected by that simple touch, while the world continued its business around them. "Daniel," a gruff voice called from deeper in the stable. "That saddle is not going to fix itself." Daniel dropped her hand reluctantly and called back, "Nearly finished, Mr. Roberts." He looked at Grace again, seeming almost desperate to keep her there. "Will you be walking this way again? Later, perhaps?" She should have said no. She should have recognized the complication this would bring, the trouble that came from a man like him showing interest in a woman like her. But there was something in his eyes, in the way he had looked at her as though she mattered, as though she were visible and valuable and worth seeing, that made her nod. "I walk home from the mercantile most afternoons," she heard herself say. His face broke into a smile that transformed his entire countenance, erasing years of hardship and replacing them with boyish hope. "Then I will watch for you." Grace left the livery feeling lighter than she had in months, despite the continued gnawing of hunger in her belly, despite the uncertain future that stretched before her. Someone had seen her. Someone had looked at her as though she mattered. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in that moment it felt like everything. The boarding house where Grace rented a room was a ramshackle structure 2 streets over from Maine, run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson who charged modest rent and asked few questions. Grace climbed the narrow stairs to her second-floor room, unlocked the door with the key she wore on a string around her neck, and stepped into the small space that contained all her worldly possessions. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a chipped basin, a trunk containing her 3 dresses, and a small table she had salvaged from an alley and repaired herself. The window looked out over the dusty street, and evening light slanted through the wavy glass, painting everything gold. She set down her basket and pulled out the bread, tearing off a small piece and chewing it slowly, making it last. Her mind kept returning to the livery, to Daniel Winters and his sky-blue eyes, to the way he had stopped working entirely just to look at her. She wondered if he thought of her now, or if his attention had already moved on to other concerns. Men were unpredictable that way, she had learned. They could show interest as intense as a lightning strike and then disappear as though they had never existed at all. But something about Daniel had felt different. The way he had said her name, the reluctance with which he had released her hand, the hope in his voice when he asked if she would walk past again. These were not the actions of a man playing at interest. These were the actions of a man who had seen something he wanted and was willing to reach for it, despite any obstacles that might stand in his way. Grace finished her meager dinner and lay down on the bed, listening to the sounds of Colfax settling into evening. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Closer, she could hear Mrs. Henderson moving around in the kitchen below, the clatter of pots and pans as she prepared her own meal. Grace closed her eyes and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a different life. One where she had enough to eat, where she did not have to worry about next month's rent, where someone like Daniel Winters might court her properly without fear of social condemnation. It was a dangerous dream, she knew. Dreams like that led to disappointment, to heartbreak, to the kind of pain that took years to heal. But lying there in the gathering darkness, with the memory of his hand in hers still warm on her skin, she let herself dream anyway. The next afternoon, Grace walked past the livery stable with her heart beating so hard she was certain everyone on the street could hear it. She tried to appear casual, as though she were simply going about her business, but her eyes sought the dim interior of the stable even as she told herself not to look. He was there. Daniel stood in nearly the same spot as yesterday, but this time he was currying a large bay horse, his movements rhythmic and practiced. He looked up as she passed, and their eyes met again. This time he smiled, wide and genuine, and Grace felt an answering smile spread across her own face before she could stop it. "Miss Patterson," he called out, setting aside the brush and walking toward her. "I was hoping you might come by." Grace stopped, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The street was relatively empty in the afternoon heat, most sensible people having retreated indoors to escape the worst of the sun. "Good afternoon, Mr. Winters." "Daniel," he said. "Please." Mr. Winters makes me sound like my father, and that is not a comparison I enjoy. There was pain in his voice when he mentioned his father, a story there that Grace wanted to know but did not feel she had the right to ask about yet. "Then you must call me Grace." "Grace," he said again, savoring it. "That walk past here every day must be hot and tiresome. Would you like some water? We have a pump out back that pulls cold from deep underground." She should have declined. She should have continued on her way, avoided the complication, protected herself from the inevitable hurt that came from wanting things she could not have. But her throat was dry, and the thought of cold water was tempting, and more than anything, she wanted to stay in his presence a little longer. "Yes, thank you. That would be kind." He led her around the side of the stable to where a pump stood next to a wooden trough. He worked the handle, and after a moment, water gushed out, clear and cold. He produced a tin cup from seemingly nowhere and filled it, handing it to her with a courtliness that seemed at odds with his rough clothing and humble station. Grace drank deeply, the cold water shocking and wonderful against her parched throat. When she finished, she handed back the cup and Daniel refilled it, drinking himself. She watched the movement of his throat as he swallowed, then forced herself to look away, feeling suddenly shy. "How long have you been in Colfax?" Daniel asked, setting down the cup and leaning against the stable wall. 6 months, Grace said. "I came from Santa Fe after my employer there died and his family had no further need of my services." "What kind of work did you do?" "I was a seamstress. I made dresses and altered clothes and repaired anything that needed mending." Grace looked down at her own dress, faded and worn. "Though you might not guess it from my appearance." "I think you look beautiful," Daniel said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made Grace's breath catch. "You should not say such things," she whispered, but she could not keep the pleasure from her voice. "Why not if they are true?" Daniel pushed off from the wall, taking a step closer to her. "I have been in Colfax for 3 years, and I have never seen anyone like you." The moment you appeared in that doorway yesterday, it was like the sun came out after a long winter. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness, by being seen and valued after so long of being treated as invisible. "You do not know me." "Then let me know you," Daniel said urgently. "Let me talk to you, walk with you, learn everything there is to learn. I do not have much to offer. I work at the livery for barely enough to pay for a room and food. I have been saving for 3 years to buy my own piece of land, but I am still far from having enough. But I am honest, and I am hardworking, and I promise I would treat you with all the respect and care you deserve." "Daniel," Grace said softly, using his name deliberately, seeing how it made his eyes light up. "There are complications you might not be considering. I am not like the other women in this town. My mother was a freed slave, my father a white man who left before I was born. People here barely acknowledge my existence. The richest man in this town walked past me yesterday as though I were invisible. What makes you think it would be any different for us?" "I do not care about any of that," Daniel said fiercely. "I do not care what Randolph Sterling thinks or what anyone else in this town thinks. You are the first person in 3 years who has made me feel like there might be something more to life than just surviving day to day. Please, Grace, give me a chance." She looked into his eyes, those impossibly blue eyes full of hope and determination, and felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She had been alone for so long, protecting herself from hurt by refusing to hope for anything better. But here was Daniel Winters, poor as she was, offering her something precious. Not money or security or social standing, but simple human connection. The chance to be seen, to be valued, to matter to someone. "I walk this way every afternoon at about this time," Grace said carefully. "And I suppose there is no law against stopping for water if the day is particularly hot." Daniel's face broke into a grin so wide and joyful it made him look years younger. "Then I will make sure there is always a clean cup ready." Grace left the livery feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted somehow, as though the world had tilted on its axis and revealed new possibilities. She knew she was being reckless, allowing herself to hope, to feel, to want. But the memory of Daniel's smile, the warmth in his voice when he said her name, the way he had looked at her as though she were the answer to a question he had been asking for years, all of it made her willing to take the risk. Over the following weeks, Grace's afternoon walk past the livery became the highlight of her day. Sometimes she and Daniel could only exchange a few words, when his employer, Mr. Roberts, was watching closely or when customers needed attention. But other times, when the stable was quiet, they would sit on overturned buckets in the shade and talk for an hour or more. Grace learned that Daniel had come to New Mexico territory from Missouri. Fleeing a father who drank away every dollar the family earned and beat his wife and children with equal enthusiasm. Daniel had left home at 16 with nothing but the clothes on his back and the determination to make something better of his life. He had worked ranches and farms, learned to break horses and mend tack, saved every penny he could spare with the dream of one day owning his own land. "I want a place of my own," he told her one afternoon, his voice full of longing. "Nothing huge, just enough acres for some cattle and horses, maybe a small house. Somewhere I could build something real, something that could not be taken away." "That sounds wonderful," Grace said softly. She understood that dream, the desire for security, for a place in the world that was truly yours. "What about you?" Daniel asked. "What do you want, Grace?" She was quiet for a moment, considering. "I want to not be invisible anymore. I want to do work I am proud of, work that uses my skills. I want to not have to worry about whether I will eat tomorrow or have a roof over my head next month. And I suppose—" She hesitated, then continued, I want to belong somewhere, to someone. I have been alone for so long. Daniel reached out and took her hand, right there in the stable where anyone might see. You are not invisible to me, and if you will let me, I would like very much for you to belong with me. Grace's heart swelled so large she thought it might burst from her chest. Daniel, we have only known each other a few weeks. I know, he said. But I also know that in those few weeks, I have come to care for you more than I have cared for anyone in my entire life. I think about you constantly. When I am working, I imagine what I will say to you when you walk by. At night, when I should be sleeping, I lie awake remembering the sound of your laugh. You have changed everything for me, Grace. She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses she had come to know so well, the strength in his fingers. You have changed everything for me, too. They sat there in comfortable silence, hands clasped, and Grace felt a peace settle over her that she had not known since childhood. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she knew there would be many, at least she would not face them alone. But their growing closeness did not go unnoticed in Colfax. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the sight of Grace Patterson stopping at the livery every afternoon began to draw attention. At first it was just curious glances, whispered conversations that stopped when she drew near. But as the weeks passed, and it became clear that this was more than casual acquaintance, the reactions grew harsher. Grace noticed it first at the mercantile, where the clerk who usually served her with brusque efficiency now refused to meet her eyes at all, shoving her purchases across the counter as though he could not bear to get close to her. Then Mrs. Henderson, her landlady, pulled her aside one evening with concern creased across her weathered face. "Grace, dear, I do not mean to pry into your business, but people are talking. They say you have been spending time with that cowboy from the livery, Daniel Winters." "I have," Grace said, lifting her chin. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Henderson?" The older woman sighed. "I am not one to judge, you know that. I rent to anyone who pays on time and keeps a clean room. But you need to understand that this town has certain expectations, certain rules about how things are done. A young woman, especially one in your position, keeping company with a young man without proper chaperone or courtship rituals, it causes talk." "We are just friends," Grace said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not entirely true. What she felt for Daniel went far beyond friendship. "Are you?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently. "Because the way people tell it, there is more than friendship in how he looks at you." Grace felt her cheeks heat. Even if there were, what business is it of theirs? In a small town, everything is everyone's business. I am just warning you to be careful. There are people in Colfax who would not take kindly to seeing a relationship like that develop, regardless of what I or anyone else thinks is right or fair. The warning proved prophetic. A few days later, as Grace was leaving the boarding house in the afternoon, 3 women from the church blocked her path on the sidewalk. Grace recognized them as members of the Ladies' Aid Society, respectable married women who wore their virtue like armor. "Miss Patterson," the tallest one said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We hoped we might have a word with you." Grace felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, but she kept her voice level. "Of course. We have become aware that you have been spending considerable time with Daniel Winters, the boy who works at the livery. We wanted to remind you that Colfax is a decent town with Christian values, and we cannot tolerate behavior that might corrupt our young people or set a bad example for impressionable minds." "I am not sure what you mean," Grace said carefully. "Daniel and I have done nothing improper." "Perhaps not by your standards," another woman interjected. "But you must understand that a girl of your background associating so freely with a white man creates certain impressions. It makes people uncomfortable." It raises questions about propriety and respectability that reflect poorly on the entire community. The words hit Grace like physical blows. She had known prejudice existed, had experienced it in countless small ways since arriving in Colfax, but this direct confrontation was something else entirely. I was not aware that friendship was a crime. "We are not speaking of crime, dear," the tall woman said, her tone suggesting she found Grace slow-witted. "We are speaking of decency and social order. Surely even you can understand that there are natural boundaries between different types of people, boundaries that exist for good reason. Daniel Winters is a poor boy, true, but he comes from respectable white stock. You are something else entirely. The combination is simply not appropriate." Grace felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce. "Perhaps you should direct these concerns to Daniel himself. I am not his keeper." "Oh, we have no doubt that a boy like that could be led astray by the right temptation," the third woman said primly. "Young men are weak that way. It is up to women of virtue to maintain proper standards and not encourage base impulses." "I am encouraging nothing improper," Grace said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "And I resent the implication that I would. We are simply trying to help you understand how things work here," the tall woman said. "For your own good, you should keep your distance from Daniel Winters. Find companions more suited to your situation. It would be better for everyone involved, including you." They swept past her then, leaving Grace standing on the sidewalk with her hands clenched into fists and tears of rage burning in her eyes. She stood there for a long moment, trying to compose herself, trying to breathe through the humiliation and anger. Then she straightened her shoulders and continued walking toward the livery. She would not let small-minded bigots dictate who she could care about or who could care about her. But when she reached the stable, she found Daniel in conversation with Randolph Sterling himself. The rich man stood next to his carriage, gesturing impatiently while Daniel held the reins of Sterling's matched pair of bay horses. Grace hesitated, not wanting to interrupt, but Daniel looked up and saw her. His face lit up immediately, and he smiled despite Sterling's obvious impatience. Sterling followed Daniel's gaze, his eyes landing on Grace for the first time since that day outside the mercantile. His expression shifted from impatience to disdain, his lip curling slightly as he took in her worn dress and worn shoes. "Winters," Sterling said sharply, reclaiming Daniel's attention. "I am speaking to you. The least you could do is pay attention." "Yes, sir," Daniel said, but his eyes kept drifting back to Grace. Sterling noticed and let out an exasperated sound. "I see you are distracted. Fine. Just make sure my horses are ready by sundown tomorrow. I am traveling to Santa Fe on business and cannot afford delays because you were too busy mooning over some colored girl to do your job properly." The casual cruelty of the words, the dismissive way Sterling spoke of her as though she were not standing right there, made Grace's chest tighten. But what hurt more was seeing the helplessness in Daniel's face, the way he had to stand there and take the insult because Sterling was a customer and Daniel needed this job. Sterling climbed into his carriage and drove off without another word, leaving Daniel standing there with the reins still in his hand and murder in his eyes. "I am sorry," he said immediately, dropping the reins and starting toward Grace. "I am so sorry you had to hear that." "It is not your fault," Grace said, though her voice was unsteady. "Men like him say what they want without consequence." "It is not right," Daniel said fiercely. "None of it is right. The way people treat you, the things they say, acting like you are somehow less than them when you have more grace and dignity in your little finger than they have in their whole bodies." Grace felt tears threaten again, but for different reasons this time. "Daniel, maybe those women were right." Maybe we should keep our distance. This is causing problems for you. I do not want to be the reason you lose your job or face trouble in town." "No," Daniel said, taking her hands in his. "Do not let them win, Grace. Do not let their hatred and ignorance take this away from us. You are the best thing that has happened to me in years, maybe ever. I do not care what they say or think." "But what kind of future could we have?" Grace asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart. "Even if we care for each other, the world does not want us to be together." "How do we fight that?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his thumbs rubbing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. Then he looked up at her with determination burning in his eyes. "We leave. We go somewhere else, somewhere we can start fresh. I have been saving for my own land anyway. There are territories out west where things are different, where people are judged more by what they can do than who their parents were. We could go to California, or maybe north to Colorado. Find a place where we can build the life we want without the whole town watching and judging every move we make." "That is a big decision," Grace said softly. "Are you sure you would want to do that? Give up everything you know, everything you have worked for here, just for a chance at something better somewhere else?" "What do I have here?" Daniel asked. "A job that barely pays enough to survive, no prospects, no future. And you are barely surviving too, taking and mending work for pennies and eating one meal a day so you can pay your rent. Separately, we have nothing. But together, we could have everything. We could build something real, something that belongs to us. I have $300 saved, Grace. That is enough to get us somewhere and buy the start of a new life. What do you say?" Grace looked into his eyes, seeing hope and fear and desperate longing all mixed together. It was madness, what he was proposing. Leaving everything familiar, traveling into the unknown with a man she had known only a few months, gambling everything on the chance that somewhere out there might be a place where they could belong. Every rational part of her mind screamed that it was too risky, too dangerous, too uncertain. But then she thought about staying in Colfax, about continuing to be invisible and unwanted, about watching Daniel struggle at the livery while Sterling and his kind treated them both like dirt beneath their boots, about growing old alone, bitter and lonely, having let fear steal away the one chance at happiness she might ever have. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, let us go." The joy that transformed Daniel's face made her certain she had made the right choice. He pulled her into his arms right there in the stable yard, propriety be damned, and held her close while she felt his heart hammering against hers. She wrapped her arms around him and held on tight, feeling safe and valued for the first time in longer than she could remember. They pulled apart reluctantly, both aware that they were courting scandal but neither quite willing to let go completely. Daniel kept her hand in his as he spoke. "We will need to plan carefully. I will need to give notice here, collect my final pay. You should settle your accounts at the boarding house, gather what you need to travel. How soon could you be ready?" Grace thought quickly. She had very little to pack, almost nothing tying her to Colfax. "A week, perhaps. I have some mending work I promised to complete, and I would need to give Mrs. Henderson notice." "A week, then," Daniel agreed. "We will leave on a Sunday morning when most of the town is at church. Take the stage to Santa Fe, then the train from there to wherever we decide to settle. I have been thinking Colorado might be good. I hear there is land available for homesteading, and the mining towns are growing fast enough that they need skilled workers of all kinds." Over the next week, Grace and Daniel made their preparations in secret. Grace finished her mending work, collecting the small payments and adding them to her meager savings. She gave Mrs. Henderson notice that she would be leaving, citing a position that had opened up in Santa Fe. The landlady looked at her with knowing eyes but said nothing beyond wishing her well. Grace packed her few belongings into the small trunk, trying not to think about how little she had accumulated in her life. 3 dresses, undergarments, a spare pair of shoes, her mother's Bible, and a small photograph of her parents taken before she was born were all she had to show for 22 years of living. But as she looked at the meager collection, she realized she did not care. Material things had never made her happy anyway. The chance at a new life, at freedom and possibility and love that was worth more than any amount of possessions. Daniel was equally busy, working extra hours at the livery to earn every penny he could, saying nothing to Mr. Roberts about his plans to leave. He hated the deception, Grace knew, because Daniel was fundamentally honest. But they both understood that announcing their intentions would only lead to trouble. Better to simply disappear, leaving no chance for anyone to interfere. On Saturday evening, Grace and Daniel met one final time behind the livery stable. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air had finally cooled to something bearable. "Tomorrow morning," Daniel said, holding both her hands. "The stage leaves at 7. I will meet you at the depot at 6:30 and we will leave Colfax behind forever." "Are you certain this is what you want?" Grace asked, needing to hear him confirm it one more time. "Once we leave, there will be no coming back." "I have never been more certain of anything," Daniel said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I want you to have this." Grace unwrapped the cloth carefully and gasped. Inside was a ring, simple silver with a small blue stone set in the center. It was not expensive, she could tell, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "It was my grandmother's," Daniel said softly. "The only thing I took from home when I left. She was the only person in my family who ever showed me real kindness, and she died when I was 12. I have carried this with me ever since, waiting for the right person to give it to." "Grace Patterson, I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards, and I know I do not have much to offer you, but I love you. I think I have loved you from the moment you appeared in that stable doorway and looked at me like I was worth seeing. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Grace's face as she looked at the ring, at Daniel's hopeful, anxious expression, at the future opening up before them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and Grace marveled at how right it felt there, as though it had been made for her specifically. Then Daniel cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and sweet, and Grace felt the last of her walls crumble completely. She kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and love into that moment, sealing their promise to each other. They reluctantly parted as full darkness fell, knowing they needed to be careful these last few hours. Daniel walked her back toward the boarding house, stopping a block away to avoid being seen together. "Tomorrow," he said, squeezing her hands one last time. "Tomorrow," Grace agreed, and walked the rest of the way alone, touching the ring on her finger as though to confirm it was real. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Colfax settling into sleep around her, and tried to calm her racing thoughts. In less than 12 hours, she would be leaving this place forever, stepping into an unknown future with Daniel. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Grace rose before dawn and dressed carefully in her best dress, which was not saying much but was at least relatively clean and intact. She gathered her trunk and took one last look around the small room that had been her home for 6 months. She felt no particular sadness at leaving it. This had never really been home, just a temporary shelter. Home, she hoped, was waiting for her somewhere down the road. She left the boarding house quietly, paying Mrs. Henderson the final week's rent she owed and thanking her for her kindness. The older woman hugged her unexpectedly, whispering, "Be safe, child, and be happy." Grace walked through the pre-dawn streets of Colfax with her trunk in hand, making her way to the stage depot. The town was still largely asleep, though she could see lights beginning to appear in windows as the earliest risers started their day. The air was cool and fresh, and birds were beginning their morning songs. The stage depot was a small building on the edge of town, and Grace's heart leaped when she saw Daniel already waiting there, his own bag at his feet. He saw her and hurried over, taking her trunk from her hands. "I was afraid you might change your mind," he admitted. "Never," Grace said firmly. "I am ready for this, Daniel. Ready for whatever comes next, as long as we face it together." They purchased their tickets from the sleepy clerk, who barely glanced at them before taking their money and pointing them toward the waiting stage coach. The driver was checking the horses, making final preparations for departure. A few other passengers were already seated inside the coach, traveling merchants by the look of them, paying no attention to the young couple climbing aboard. As the stage began to roll forward, Grace looked out the window at Colfax receding into the distance. She felt no regret, no longing to stay. This place had never wanted her, had never seen her as fully human and deserving of dignity. But Daniel had seen her. Daniel had looked at her and couldn't look away, had valued her for who she was rather than dismissing her for what she represented. That was everything. Daniel reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "To new beginnings," he said softly. "To new beginnings," Grace echoed, and settled back against the hard seat, ready to face whatever the future might hold. The journey to Santa Fe took the better part of 2 days, the stage stopping at way stations to change horses and allow passengers to eat and rest. Grace and Daniel attracted some curious glances from other travelers, but most people were too focused on their own discomfort and exhaustion to pay much attention to anyone else. In Santa Fe, they found a small church where a Mexican priest, after some initial surprise, agreed to marry them. Father Miguel asked no questions about their backgrounds or their plans, simply performed the ceremony in Spanish-accented English, while 2 of his parishioners served as witnesses. Grace spoke her vows with tears in her eyes, feeling the weight and wonder of promising herself to another person, of choosing to bind her life to Daniel's. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Daniel kissed her with such tender reverence that Grace felt her heart might break from the sheer joy of it. They spent their wedding night in a modest hotel, and Grace discovered what it meant to be truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. Daniel treated her as though she were made of precious glass, asking permission before each touch, making sure she was comfortable and willing every step of the way. And when they finally came together completely, Grace felt as though pieces of herself she had not even known were missing suddenly clicked into place. The next morning, they boarded a train heading north to Colorado. Grace had never been on a train before, and she pressed her face to the window like a child, watching the landscape roll past at impossible speeds. Daniel sat beside her with his arm around her shoulders, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about his travels through the territory. They reached Denver in late September of 1877, when the aspen trees were turning gold in the mountains, and there was a crisp promise of winter in the air. The city was booming with silver money, growing so fast that new buildings seemed to spring up overnight. But Daniel and Grace did not linger in Denver. They took another smaller train to a town called Leadville, high in the mountains, where silver strikes had created opportunities for anyone willing to work hard. Leadville was rough and raw, a town thrown together quickly to house the thousands of prospectors and workers flooding into the area. But it was also a place where the normal social rules seemed to matter less than they had in Colfax. People were too focused on finding their fortunes to care much about who was married to whom or what color their skin might be. Daniel found work almost immediately at one of the larger mines, not going underground himself, but working in the stables that housed the mules used to haul ore. The pay was better than anything he had earned in New Mexico, and within a week, they had enough to rent a small cabin on the outskirts of town. Grace set up housekeeping in their cabin with a fierce determination to make it a real home. She scrubbed the rough wooden floors, hung curtains she sewed from spare fabric, coaxed the wood stove into cooperation, and she put out her shingle as a seamstress, offering her services to the saloon girls and shopkeepers and miners' wives who needed skilled work done on their clothing. To her surprise and delight, business came quickly. The boom economy meant people had money to spend, and a good seamstress was in high demand. Within a month, Grace had more work than she could handle, mending torn trousers and fancy dresses, altering shirts and sewing new garments from scratch. She worked by lamplight late into the evening, her needle flashing as she created beauty from scraps of cloth. Daniel would come home, each evening exhausted from his work at the mine, smelling of horse and sweat and mountain air, and Grace would have dinner waiting. They would eat together at their small table, talking about their days, making plans for the future. After dinner, Daniel would often help her with the simpler mending tasks, his large hands surprisingly deft with needle and thread. "My grandmother taught me," he explained the first time Grace expressed surprise at his skill. "She said every person should know how to take care of their own clothes, regardless of whether they were man or woman. My father used to mock me for it, but now I am glad she insisted." They saved every penny they could, living frugally despite the money coming in. Both of them had known too much poverty to take security for granted, and both of them still dreamed of that piece of land Daniel had talked about. Land they could own outright, where they could build something permanent. Winter came to the mountains with brutal force, bringing snow that piled higher than Grace had ever imagined possible. The cabin was drafty and cold, and they spent their evenings huddled close to the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. But Grace found she did not mind the cold or the hardship. She was happier than she had ever been in her life, waking up each morning next to the man she loved, building a life together through their combined efforts. In the spring of 1878, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for several weeks, but when she finally confirmed it with the town's doctor, a gruff but competent man named Dr. Harrison, she felt a mix of joy and terror. She and Daniel had talked about having children eventually, but they were still so new to marriage, still trying to establish their lives in Leadville. When she told Daniel that evening, he stared at her for a long moment in stunned silence. Then he swept her into his arms, spinning her around the cabin while she laughed and protested that he would make her dizzy. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Grace, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Daniel said, setting her down carefully as though she might break. He placed his hand gently over her still flat stomach. "We made this. You and me together, a whole new person who will be part both of us." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Grace continued her seamstress work as long as she could, though she had to start refusing the more detailed projects as her belly grew, and she could no longer sit comfortably for long periods. Daniel became almost comically protective, insisting she rest more, bringing home small treats from the general store whenever he could afford them. In October, as the aspen leaves were again turning gold, Grace went into labor. Dr. Harrison was summoned, and he took over their cabin with brisk efficiency. Daniel held Grace's hand through the long hours of labor, whispering encouragement, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, refusing to leave her side despite the doctor's suggestion that he might want to wait outside. Just after midnight, their son was born, tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. Dr. Harrison placed the baby in Grace's arms, and she stared down at him in wonder, unable to quite believe that this small person had come from her body, that she and Daniel had created him together. "He is beautiful," Daniel whispered, tears running unashamedly down his face. "What should we name him?" Grace thought of her own father, the man she had never known but whose blood ran in her veins nonetheless. She thought of Daniel's grandmother, the woman who had shown him kindness in a harsh childhood. "What was your grandmother's maiden name?" she asked. "Lawrence," Daniel said. "Her family name was Lawrence." "Then let us call him Lawrence," Grace said. "Lawrence Daniel Winters. A name that honors where we come from but belongs entirely to him." They shortened it to Lawrence in daily use, and the baby became the center of their world. Grace had heard other women complain about the exhaustion of caring for an infant, and it was true that Lawrence demanded constant attention. But Grace found she did not mind the sleepless nights or the endless feeding and changing. Each time she looked at her son, she saw proof that good things could come from love, that hope was not foolish, that building a life was possible even in the face of a world that often seemed determined to tear people apart. Daniel was a devoted father, coming home from the mine each day eager to hold his son, walking the floor with Lawrence when he fussed, singing off-key lullabies that somehow soothed the baby better than anything else. On Sundays, their one day off, they would bundle Lawrence up and walk through the mountains, showing him the gold and red of autumn leaves, the brilliant white of fresh snow, the purple wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in summer. Over the next several years, they built their life in Leadville with steady determination. Daniel continued working at the mine, eventually being promoted to foreman of the stables with a corresponding increase in pay. Grace's seamstress business grew until she had to turn away customers, focusing on the most lucrative projects. They saved diligently, adding to their nest egg week by week, month by month. In 1880, when Lawrence was 2 years old, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less surprised and more prepared, knowing what to expect. Their daughter was born in May of 1881, arriving quickly and with far less difficulty than Lawrence had. They named her Margaret, after no one in particular, simply because Grace had always loved the name. Margaret was different from Lawrence from the start, louder, more demanding, with a fierce temper that reminded Daniel of his grandmother and made him laugh even when she was screaming at 3 in the morning. Grace loved her daughter with the same fierce intensity she loved her son, marveling at how different two children from the same parents could be. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Work and family, saving and planning, small joys and occasional setbacks. They made friends in Leadville, people who judged them by their character and their work rather than their backgrounds. Grace became close with several other women in town, and they would gather weekly to sew and share stories while their children played together. In the spring of 1883, after 6 years of saving, Daniel came home one evening with news that made Grace's heart race. A man he knew from the mine was selling his homestead claim, 160 acres of land about 20 miles outside of Leadville. The man's wife hated the isolation and wanted to move back east, and he was willing to sell the claim and the small house he had built for far less than it was worth, just to be done with it quickly. "We have enough," Daniel said, excitement making his words tumble over each other. "Grace, we have enough saved to buy it outright, our own land, a place that belongs to us that no one can ever take away. What do you think?" Grace looked around their small cabin, the place where both their children had been born, where they had built their life together. It had been a good home. But the idea of owning land, of having space for the children to run and play, of building something permanent, it was the dream they had held since the beginning. "Let us go look at it," she said. They made the trip the following Sunday, leaving the children with their friend Alina. The land was beautiful, nestled in a high valley with mountains rising on all sides. A small creek ran through the property, providing water year-round. The house was simple but solid, larger than their cabin in town, with 2 bedrooms and a main room with a fireplace. There was a barn that needed some repair, fencing that needed mending, and more work than Grace could easily imagine. But standing there on that land, with Daniel's arm around her waist and the sun warm on her face, Grace could see their future with perfect clarity. Gardens and animals, children running through the meadows, years of hard work and simple satisfactions. A place to belong, finally and completely. "We should do it," she said. They closed the sale within 2 weeks and began the slow process of moving their belongings from town to the homestead. Daniel gave notice at the mine, and Grace finished up her remaining seamstress commissions. On a bright morning in June, they loaded everything they owned into a borrowed wagon and made the journey to their new home, Lawrence and Margaret bouncing with excitement in the back. The first year on the homestead was the hardest. Daniel had to learn farming in addition to the horse work he already knew, making mistakes and recovering from them, slowly figuring out what crops would grow at this altitude and how to manage livestock through the brutal mountain winters. Grace worked from dawn to dusk, keeping house, caring for the children, maintaining a large garden that provided much of their food, and still taking in some seamstress work when she could to bring in extra money. But they were happy. Happier than Grace had ever imagined possible. Lawrence grew tall and strong, helping his father with the farm work as soon as he was old enough. Margaret was spirited and stubborn, but with a kind heart that showed itself in how gently she cared for the chickens and the barn cats. And Grace and Daniel fell more deeply in love with each passing year, their relationship deepening from that initial intense attraction into something richer and more complex, built on shared struggles and shared triumphs, on knowing each other completely and choosing each other anyway. In 1885, Grace gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel and Sarah. The double blessing nearly overwhelmed their small household, but Lawrence and Margaret stepped up to help and they managed. The farm prospered slowly but steadily. Daniel proved to have a gift for horse breeding, and people started coming from surrounding areas to buy his stock. Grace's garden grew larger each year, and she began preserving food not just for their own use, but to sell in town. The years rolled by, marked by the changing of seasons, the growth of children, the steady accumulation of small victories. Lawrence grew into a serious young man who shared his father's love of horses. Margaret became a skilled rider and an even better shot, able to bring down deer and elk to supplement the family's meat supply. Samuel developed a head for numbers and started keeping the farm's accounts before he was 12. Sarah inherited her mother's skill with needle and thread, creating beautiful embroidery that decorated their home. In 1890, when they had been married 13 years, Grace and Daniel took a rare day for themselves, leaving the children in Lawrence's capable care and riding up into the mountains to a meadow they had discovered years before. It was summer, and wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, painting the ground in every color imaginable. They spread a blanket and lay side by side, looking up at the impossibly blue sky. "You ever think about Colfax?" Grace asked, the question coming from nowhere. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes, but only to marvel at how much life can change. That poor cowboy working at the livery, barely scraping by, feeling like he had no future. I can hardly recognize him anymore. And that beautiful woman who stopped for water on a hot afternoon, the one I could not stop looking at, she is even more beautiful now, though she does not know it. Grace turned her head to look at him. I know I am not beautiful, Daniel. I am 33 years old with 4 children. I have worked hard every day for years. I am not the young woman you met in that stable. You are wrong, Daniel said, rolling onto his side and propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Not despite the years and the work and the children, but because of them. Every line on your face was earned through laughter or worry or determination. Every callus on your hands represents something you built or grew or created. You are everything I dreamed of and more than I deserved. We both deserved better than what we had, Grace said softly, but we made better for ourselves. Together. Together, Daniel agreed. He leaned down and kissed her, slow and sweet, a kiss that contained 13 years of marriage and 4 children and countless shared sunrises and sunsets. When they finally drew apart, Grace smiled up at him. I love you, Daniel Winters. I loved you from the moment you looked at me like I mattered, and I will love you until the day I die. That is a good thing, Daniel said with that grin she still loved so much, because you are stuck with me now. We have land and children and a whole life together. You can't get rid of me even if you wanted to. I never want to, Grace said, and pulled him back down for another kiss. The years continued their steady march forward. Lawrence married in 1895, bringing home a sweet-natured girl named Emily from one of the neighboring ranches. They built a small house on the far corner of the property and started their own family, giving Grace and Daniel their first grandchild in 1896, a boy they named Daniel in honor of his grandfather. Margaret proved more difficult to settle, rejecting suitor after suitor until finally, at 22, she met a cowboy named Jack who was as stubborn and spirited as she was. They married in 1903 in a ceremony held in the meadow full of wildflowers, with half the county in attendance. Samuel went to Denver to study accounting and returned with a wife and a head full of ideas about diversifying the farm's income. Sarah married young, at 19, to a gentle blacksmith from Leadville. Through it all, Grace and Daniel remained the center around which their family orbited. Their house became the gathering place for Sundays and holidays, filled with children and grandchildren, with laughter and stories and the smells of Grace's cooking. The farm prospered beyond their wildest early dreams, becoming one of the most successful operations in the area. In 1910, Daniel turned 53 and Grace 52. Their children were all grown and settled. They had 10 grandchildren, with more on the way. The farm ran smoothly, with Lawrence taking over most of the day-to-day operations while Daniel focused on the horse breeding that remained his first love. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Grace leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked. "When you first saw me in that stable in Colfax, did you have any idea we would end up here?" "I imagined wanting to know you," Daniel said, wrapping his arm around her. "I imagined hoping you might feel something for me too. But this," he gestured at the land spreading out before them, the house full of family photos and mementos, the barns and fences that represented decades of work. "This is beyond anything I could have dreamed. You gave me all of this, Grace. You and your courage to leave everything behind for a chance at something better." "We gave it to each other," Grace corrected gently. "I could never have done any of this alone, and I would not have wanted to." Everything good in my life traces back to that afternoon when a poor cowboy looked at me and saw someone worth knowing, someone worth loving. You gave me that, Daniel. You saw me when the richest man in town could not be bothered to acknowledge my existence. You looked at me and could not look away, and that changed everything. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank behind the mountains, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their daughter-in-law Emily calling them to come wash up for dinner. The smells of cooking food drifted out through the open windows, mingling with the scent of pine and wildflowers carried on the evening breeze. Grace thought about that young woman she had been, standing outside the mercantile in Colfax with her hand raised and her hope crushed. She thought about how invisible she had felt, how small and insignificant. She could hardly believe that woman and the one sitting here now were the same person. Life had taken her on such an unexpected journey, from rejection and poverty to love and prosperity, from being ignored to being seen fully and cherished completely. "You have any regrets?" Daniel asked softly, as though reading her thoughts. Grace considered the question seriously, looking back over the decades of her life. There had been hard times, certainly. The winter when Margaret nearly died from pneumonia. The drought year when they almost lost the farm. The day they learned that Lawrence had been thrown from a horse and broken his leg in 3 places. The countless small heartbreaks and disappointments that came with any life lived fully. But regrets? No, not a single one, she said firmly. Every choice we made, every hardship we endured, every risk we took, all of it led us here. To this life, this family, this love. I would not change any of it. "Neither would I," Daniel said, kissing the top of her head. "You are still the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, Grace Winters. And I still cannot look away." Grace smiled and settled more comfortably against his side, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body, the complete rightness of being exactly where she was. The grandchildren burst out onto the porch then, calling for them to come inside for dinner, and Grace and Daniel rose slowly, their bodies not as young as they once were, but still strong, still capable, still very much alive. They walked into their home hand in hand, into the light and warmth and laughter, into the life they had built together through courage and determination and love. Behind them, the sun finished its descent behind the mountains, and the stars emerged in their full glory, watching over the land where Grace and Daniel Winters had planted their dreams and raised their family. The story that had begun with a moment of being seen, truly seen for the first time, had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. From that first exchange of glances in a dusty stable in New Mexico territory, to this full, rich life surrounded by children and grandchildren and decades of shared love, they had proved that the most important thing in the world was not money or status or social approval. The most important thing was simple: to be seen by the right person, to be valued for who you truly were, to find someone who looked at you and could not look away. Everything else, the land, the prosperity, the family, the happiness, all of it flowed from that single moment of genuine human connection. As Grace sat down to dinner surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, with Daniel beside her and 3 generations of their family filling their home with joy, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for the courage to leave Colfax, for the faith to believe in something better, for the love that had sustained them through every challenge. And gratitude most of all for Daniel, for the poor cowboy who had looked at her and seen not just another struggling person to be ignored, but a woman worth knowing, worth loving, worth building a life with. He had given her the greatest gift anyone could give another person. He had made her visible. And in being seen by him, she had finally been able to see herself clearly too, to recognize her own worth and dignity and right to happiness. The years continued to pass in the way years do, each one bringing its own mixture of joy and sorrow, growth and change. Grace and Daniel grew older together, their hair turning silver, their steps slowing, but their love never diminishing. They watched their grandchildren grow up and have children of their own, extending their family tree further with each generation. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1917, the family threw them a massive celebration, with people coming from all over Colorado to honor them. Grace wore a dress that Sarah had made especially for the occasion, deep blue silk that brought out her eyes. Daniel wore his best suit, the one he saved for special occasions, and stood beside his wife with obvious pride. Their oldest grandchild, young Daniel, now 21 and a man grown, stood to make a toast. "To my grandparents," he said, raising his glass, "who proved that love is stronger than prejudice, that determination can overcome any obstacle, and that the best things in life are worth fighting for. May we all be lucky enough to find what you two have found in each other." The assembled crowd raised their glasses and cheered, and Grace felt tears streaming down her face. She looked at Daniel and saw his eyes were equally wet, and they laughed together at their shared sentimentality. That night, lying in bed in the house they had called home for 34 years, Grace and Daniel held each other close. 40 years, Grace murmured. "How did that happen, one day at a time?" Daniel said. "One morning waking up beside you, one evening watching the sunset together, one crisis survived, one joy celebrated, all of it adding up to a lifetime." "The best lifetime," Grace said. "Thank you, Daniel, for seeing me, for loving me, for never giving up on us." "Thank you for saying yes," Daniel replied. "For taking a chance on a poor cowboy with nothing but dreams and determination, for building this life with me. I love you, Grace. I loved you at first sight in that stable, and I will love you with my last breath." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, content in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply, and left a legacy that would extend far beyond their own lives. Daniel passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1922, at the age of 65. He simply did not wake up one morning, having gone to bed the night before after a typical day of working with his beloved horses. Grace found him there, looking peaceful, and though her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, she was grateful that he had gone without pain or suffering, surrounded by the things he loved in the home they had built together. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, testament to the life Daniel had lived and the respect he had earned. Grace stood beside his grave with their 4 children supporting her, watching as they lowered him into the earth, and felt as though part of herself was being buried with him. The months that followed were the hardest of Grace's life. She had been with Daniel for 45 years, longer than she had lived without him, and his absence was a physical ache that never quite went away. But she was not alone. Her children and grandchildren rallied around her, making sure she was never isolated, always including her in their lives and activities. Grace continued living on the farm, unable to imagine leaving the place where she and Daniel had been so happy. Lawrence and Emily had long since taken over the operations, and Grace spent her days tending her garden, sewing and spoiling her great-grandchildren who were now beginning to appear. She lived for another 16 years, dying peacefully in 1938 at the age of 80. Her last words, spoken to Sarah who was sitting beside her bed, were, "Tell your father I am coming home." They buried her next to Daniel on a hillside overlooking the farm, with a simple headstone that read, "Grace Patterson Winters, 1858-1938, beloved wife, mother, Grandmother, she was seen and loved at the funeral, now attended by over 500 people including 4 generations of family. Lawrence stood to deliver the eulogy. He was 60 years old, his own hair silver now, but he spoke with the clarity of someone who understood exactly what his parents had given him. "My mother and father came from nothing," he said. "They were poor, they faced prejudice and hardship, they had every reason to give up or become bitter. But instead, they chose love. They chose to see the best in each other and to build something beautiful together. Every single person here today, every child, grandchild, and great-grandchild, every friend whose life they touched, is proof of what 2 people can accomplish when they truly see each other, truly value each other, truly love each other. We are their legacy, and we will carry their love forward into the future." The family did exactly that. The farm remained in the Winters family for generations, eventually being designated as a historical property. Grace and Daniel's descendants spread across the country, becoming teachers and doctors, ranchers and business people, artists and scientists. But all of them carried the story of their ancestors, who had defied the prejudices of their time to build a life based on love and mutual respect. The story of Grace and Daniel became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of how the richest man in town ignored her completely, but the poor cowboy saw her and could not look away. How that single moment of truly being seen had led to a love that lasted a lifetime, and a legacy that extended far beyond what either of them could have imagined. And though Grace and Daniel were long gone, their love remained, woven into the very fabric of the land they had tamed, the family they had raised, and the lives they had touched. It stood as proof that the most powerful force in the world was not money or status or social approval, but the simple, revolutionary act of truly seeing another person and choosing to love them completely. Their story lived on, a testament to courage and hope and the transformative power of love, inspiring everyone who heard it to look beyond surface judgments and see the inherent worth and dignity in every human being. It was a story that had started with a glance in a dusty stable and had grown into something timeless, a love story for the ages that reminded everyone who heard it that being truly seen by the right person could change everything. And in the end, that was the greatest gift Grace and Daniel had given to the world. The reminder that every person deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be loved for exactly who they are. That message, carried forward by their descendants and all whose lives they touched, ensured that Grace and Daniel's love story would never truly end, but would continue to inspire hope and courage in all who heard it, for as long as there were people who believed in the redemptive power of love.